All right, let's get right into it. We're going to talk about one of the most fascinating and honestly misunderstood relationships in all of history. I'm talking about that huge shift from ancient paganism to Christianity. It's a story that's absolutely filled with these quiet ghosts of old traditions, and you'd be surprised how much they still echo in our world today.
And there's no better way to kick this off than with a question you've probably heard a million times, or maybe even asked yourself, right? Is Christmas really just a pagan holiday, with a fresh coat of Christian paint? It's that debate that just blows up every December, but its roots, they go way, way deeper, and they set the stage for a much bigger story.
So the most popular theory, the one you hear all the time, is what a lot of scholars call the history of religions theory. And the idea is pretty simple. Back in the year 274, the Roman Emperor Aurelian created this big festival for the sun god Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, and he set it for December 25th. So the theory goes the early church, being pretty smart about it, strategically plopped Christmas on the very same day. Why? To co-opt this huge celebration and make it way easier for pagans to convert.
But believe me, this argument is anything but new. I mean, just look at this quote. It shows you just how white-hot this topic was nearly 500 years ago. During the Protestant Reformation, you had guys like John Knox who saw Christmas as a totally made-up thing. He called it an abomination with zero basis in the Bible. He actually argued it should be outlawed. So yeah, this wasn't some friendly academic debate. It was a full-on theological battle.
Okay, so to really get how this all went down, we've got to hit rewind. Before Christianity was in any position to absorb other traditions, it was this small, persecuted religion. I mean, literally fighting for its survival in a pagan world. Let's take a look at that incredible reversal of fortune.
And this quote from the Roman historian Tacitus, it just paints such a brutal picture. We're in the year 64, right after the Great Fire of Rome, and Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat, so he pointed the finger at the early Christians. And listen to that language. They were hated for their abominations. This wasn't just, a minor disagreement. This was a deep, hostile rejection from the rest of society.
And this timeline, it just perfectly captures how fast everything flipped. I mean, think about it. In just over 300 years, Christians went from being hunted down under Nero to having their religion made legal by Constantine. And by the end of that same century, emperors weren't just tolerating Christianity, they were actively pulling funding from pagan cults and banning their most important rituals. It was a complete 180. Just incredible.
So you'd think, right? With all this new power, Christianity just declared war, smashed all the idols, burned the temples, and crushed the old pagan world. That's the popular image anyway. But when you look at the actual physical evidence, well, it tells a much, much more complicated story.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting and a little nuanced. Christian writers from that time, they used what we call a rhetoric of conquest. I mean, their stories are just full of these triumphant tales of paganism being totally defeated. But then, when archaeologists actually get their hands dirty and start digging, they find a totally different reality. It looks less like temples were violently destroyed in some big wave, and more like they were just abandoned. They fell apart because the money dried up, or they were slowly, piece by piece, repurposed over a long, long time.
And hey, if you want a number to put on that difference, get this. Of all the temple destructions mentioned in the ancient writings, 43 of them, archaeologists have only found actual physical proof for this many. Just 4. That is a huge gap between the story that was told and what really happened. It totally challenges that narrative of a violent, swift takeover.
So if it wasn't this campaign of outright destruction, then what actually happened? Well, it wasn't really a conquest. It was more of a slow, kind of messy, and honestly fascinating process of absorption and adaptation. The old world didn't just disappear. It sort of merged with the new one.
And this whole absorption thing, it wasn't an accident. A lot of the time, it was official policy. I mean, a perfect example is this advice from Pope Gregory the Great. He's writing to missionaries in England around the year 601. And just look at the strategy he lays out. Don't destroy their temples. Instead, get rid of the idols inside, purify the building, and then replace their altars with Christian relics. And maybe most importantly, transform their pagan festivals into Christian feasts. It's a genius playbook, really. Keep the familiar traditions, but change what they mean.
And you can literally see this merger happening in the earliest Christian art. It's fascinating. For instance, you know that classic image of a person praying with their hands up? That was taken directly from pagan art. The whole Good Shepherd imagery? Yep, borrowed from a pagan symbol of kindness and philanthropy. Even the halo. It probably evolved from the pagan custom of putting a shell behind a figure's head on a coffin to show they were important. In every single case, they took a familiar pagan shape and just poured new Christian meaning into it.
All right, so now that we have all this context about adaptation and absorption, let's circle all the way back to our original question about December 25th. Because it turns out that whole Sol Invictus theory, well, it isn't the only game in town.
So today, modern scholarship is pretty much split between two main ideas. We've already talked about the history of religions theory, the one that says it was a strategic move to replace a pagan holiday. But there's another really compelling idea called the calculation theory, and it argues that date was figured out using, well, purely theological math.
Let's break this down a bit. The history of religions theory, that's all about co-opting the Sol Invictus festival to win over pagan converts. The calculation theory, though, it starts from a completely different place. There was this ancient belief that great figures died on the exact same calendar day that they were conceived. So early Christians believed Christ's crucifixion happened around March 25th. If he was also conceived on March 25th, well, you just count forward 9 months. And where do you land? December 25th. So what was it? A savvy cultural strategy or a deep theological calculation? The debate is still very much alive.
So when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? I think it's that history is never, ever a simple story of winners and losers, of one thing ending and something new just starting. It's always this complicated, tangled legacy. The change from a pagan Roman Empire to a Christian one wasn't some flip of a switch. It was a messy, centuries-long process. You had moments of real conflict, sure, but you also had long stretches of just coexistence, and this really deliberate co-opting of art and ideas and traditions. The most important thing to remember is that history is a synthesis, right? It's not a clean break with the past. The ghosts of those older cultures, they persist. They're still with us in the holidays we celebrate and the traditions we follow today.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. Once you start looking for them, you start seeing these cultural ghosts everywhere. So the question for you is, where else in our modern world, in your own life, can you see the ghosts of older traditions still living on?